Good afternoon and welcome to Conspiracy Con. You're here at the Marriott Hotel in Santa Clara, California. I'm your MC, Robert Perella, and Conspiracy Con is a conference and in-depth look at what we have in the way of mind control, surveillance, occultic practices, extraterrestrial science, government cover-ups, and conspiracies. What's behind the curtain that affects you and impacts your life. Today we have Douglas Dietrich. You're going to find this a very incredible presentation. Douglas Dietrich has a history that is very vast. He has spent over 10 years there at the San Francisco Presidio military base, which led to evidence that he was ordered to destroy. There were very satanic and occultic practices there within happening right here in California. He is also a veteran of both Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So we salute you on that for sure. Thank you. Thank you. Today's presentation by him is Satan's Crusaders, the Coming Age of the Devil's Presidio Playground. I think you're going to find this an incredible presentation. Brace for impact. This is Douglas Dietrich.
Thanks so much. We're kind of limited on time right now, so I'm going to give you what I can within a shorter period of time. What we start off with is a condition of total war, which involved the Presidio military base of San Francisco as the western headquarters of the Western Defense Command of the United States Army. The entire 6th Army of the United States was stationed at the Presidio military base of San Francisco. And in time of war, what had happened was, as Brian Hall had mentioned with a few of the lectures here, they brought up the Roswell incident, which was in 1947. So he wanted me to enter with that specific incident and some of the perspectives on it in terms of the documents that I dealt with. It's very minor and peripheral, but it's a great segue into what we're talking about because what I'm talking about is so vast in terms of the Second World War, and as it ground down into a ceasefire, the best way that you can find out about what happened in the Second World War is simply to buy my DVD, Roswell and the Rising Sun. I'm going to try and tell you, however, that one of the things Brian Hall brought up was that one of the lecturers here was talking about a Reich influence at the Roswell incident, which is very popular. We all know that Annie Jacobson's getting a lot of support from the establishment and getting on a lot of national venues to push some real solid disinformation concerning Area 51, and the last 7 pages of her book add a real muddled history behind Roswell, which just further serves to confuse the issue. But having dealt with the documents myself, having collated them and absconded with a fair amount of debris, I definitely refer you again to Roswell and the Rising Sun to get the perspective on it. Suffice to say, as Brian Hall wanted me to bring up, there's a vast difference in terms of occult terminology, in cult symbology, and how people filter them through culture. The swastika has been in Asia forever. Whether it's China or Japan, it's been viewed as the heart of Amitabha Buddha, the Bodhisattva. And as a result of that, many Asian vehicles, whether Chinese or Japanese, bore the swastika. So when people found the swastika on various shards of material at Roswell, then their instant interpretation of it from a Western perspective was that of Nazi. And so they're seeing it through a cultural filter. I try to explain that more in my DVD, and I refer you to that. But in terms of another cultural filter, when we're talking about occult warfare, what was it that, in a modern sense, got the Americans so obsessed with occult warfare? What convinced them that it worked? Well, it goes back to 1945, and it's less to do with the Nazis and far more to do with the Japanese. What happened was there was a Japanese organization known as Kuromaku, or Black Curtain, and it was this organization, at the behest of Emperor Hirohito, that sent an ultimatum known as the Showa Ultimatum to the United States in 1945 after the United States went nuclear at Hiroshima. That ultimatum was sent on dirigibles that violated American airspace, which the Japanese had been violating throughout the war. And I've spoken of this on the Bob Oliver Show. I've spoken to this on a few other venues, but again, the DVD goes into that. But once the ultimatum was delivered, the Americans took it extremely seriously, not just due to the biocidal weapons, which were designed by Emperor Hirohito, who was the only scientist in the history of mankind to rule a nation state. until the advent of Angela Merkel being elected as the Prime Minister of United Germany, there is no other case in the history of mankind where a trained scientist ruled a nation state. And Emperor Hirohito was the first, and he was a marine biologist. He headed an enormous biocidal weapons development program. When the Americans were threatened with it, they took seriously what he had to say, but it wasn't the biocidal so much that he was threatening them with as well on the field as he was with occult weapons. And in response to that, they dispatched a scientist via the General Headquarters of the United States Army Forces. They deployed Carl T. Compton. Carl T. Compton was the director of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Section of the Pacific. And he was set to compile a report on scientific intelligence survey in Japan, volumes 1 through 5. This is in the U.S. National Archives at College Park, Maryland. It's RG 165, box 2056. It's volumes 1 through 5. It'll talk about death rays. It'll talk about the Japanese Genzai Bakudan, or the Japanese atomic bomb. It's volumes 6 through 10 have been excised. They are not available to the public. I helped to destroy them, and they deal with occult warfare. And here's some of what we're talking about. What happened was that when Dr. Carl T. Compton was dispatched to Japan, what was he sent to investigate? Was he sent to watch the blowing of the Japanese atomic bomb? No, he was not. He was sent to measure the drag and the depth of Mongolian anchors outside of the Japanese Pacific coast that was subject to invasion by the Mongols many 700 years ago. And the reason that he was instructed to do that was because he was verifying what the Japanese had claimed, and what they were claiming they could re-invoke. This is actually Photoshop, and it's a Photoshop of a Japanese piloted rocket bomb. And the reason I had to Photoshop one is because there is no photograph of a rocket bomb hitting an American ship, because no rocket bomb would ever, first of all, reach an American ship. It would disintegrate because it was going at Mach speed. Once it hit the speed of sound, everybody in the vicinity, sailors, would go deaf because their ears would start to bleed because the sound barrier had been shattered. It was a Japanese version of a proximity fuse. It damaged the hull of ships, and no one was ever able to photograph it because of the speed heading into hull contact. I do, however, in my DVD, Roswell and the Rising Sun, have photos of them being launched. And the result was something like this. This is the USS Essex in 1944. This photo is not blurry simply because it's appearing on a screen. This photo is blurry because of the shock waves are so huge, so tremendous from it shattering before it reaches the hull, that shock wave causes damage to the hull, deafens everybody who's in the vicinity, sends shockwaves all the way across the water to the people who were taking the photos of it, and that jarred their camera to such an extent that it blurs. It actually says that in the context. This is, again, in the U.S. National Archives. So is it technological advances like this that were scaring the American military? No, it's what the Japanese were drawing up with them. The Japanese were trying to invoke the spirit of the original kamikaze, because 700 years ago, in the May of 1281, Kublai Khan invaded Japan. And when Kublai Khan invaded Japan, he built the largest fleet that had ever been seen on the face of the earth. All of these ships, 4,400 of them, were built by Ming and Korean engineers. Every single one of them was built like the Monitor of the USS Monitor of Civil War fame. These were massive riverboats. They were twice the size of any European seagoing vessel. And the idea of riverboats hitting the high seas to invade Japan may sound absurd, but people don't understand how close the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese islands are. They are so close that if you drink a can of beer on the Japanese home islands and you throw it into the water, it will wash up on a Korean beach. And that's how close they are. That's why you could build a bridge between South Korea and Japan. The only thing that stopped that kind of development is politics. So what had happened was, in terms of 1281, when Kublai Khan hit the shores of Japan with a whole load of riverboats, larger than what the Americans landed with at D-Day, he had over 70,000 Mongol Marines that were armed with the latest technology of his time. The Turkish composite crossbow, which could fire over 350 yards away. And the samurai had nothing to compete with that. His boats had catapult launchers that shot shells that were frag and shrap, meaning fragmentary and shrapnel shells launched by catapult that were killing the samurai from a distance. There was no way the Japanese could get up close. The invasion was a guaranteed success. They were going to complete it in a day. There was nothing the Emperor of Japan could do at that time except get down on his knees and pray to the gods of his ancestors. And at that point, they answered with what became known in the Japanese occult lexicon as the kamikaze. And what happened was at that time, a super typhoon hit Arakan's fleet and accelerated within 6 hours to over 20-meter waves. So there was no time for evasive action. Dr. Compton's team proved this because when they measured the depth and direction of drag by excavated Mongol anchors, they calculated that the winds ongoing on that day must have been 150 miles per hour. And every single man on that fleet died. 70,000 Mongols lost their lives in the largest loss of life at sea ever recorded, and it's never been beaten. It would be the equivalent of the entire D-Day fleet sinking. And the Japanese told the Americans, we can do this again. And that was the whole purpose of the kamikaze. It was named after that phenomena, and by making enough sacrifices, by mobilizing enough participation, anyone who tells you that this was a desperate action on a few isolated, cynical admirals and army commanders is totally ignorant of the reality. The entire Japanese industry was mobilized into providing the needs of the kamikaze corps. All they could get in terms of seniors, cripples, children, all they needed to teach them was a 70-meter dive in the dark. And this was what was going to wipe the Americans out, people would think, but that's not the case. It was what they were going to draw up with it. So how does that impact us later on? What happened was when Compton was stationed in Japan after the ceasefire was declared in 1945 on September 8th, he had a whole bunch of men on Okinawa with him. And they were sitting there waiting to see what would happen. And just as the Japanese predicted and just as they threatened with, after the ceasefire on September 8th, on October 4th, the kamikaze manifested. It was a typhoon spotted developing in the Caroline Islands. Guam Weather Central reported the storm as Louise, said that the advisory said it was nothing, it was going to turn into nothing, it couldn't possibly turn into nothing. Fairly predictable path to the northwest, expected to pass between Formosa, Taiwan, the island where I was born, and Okinawa, and onto the East China Sea. At this time, however, the storm began to veer sharply to the right and head north towards Okinawa, which the Americans had just conquered. And when it hit that island, it impacted the Americans tremendously. On October 8th, the 17th advisory that warned of it showed clearly that the units all needed to be alerted for storm preparation and banging down the hatches because the storm slowed down as it approached Okinawa and began to greatly increase in intensity, unnaturally so. The sudden shift of the storm caught all of the ships and small craft in the constricted waters of what the Americans call Buckner Bay, unable to escape. And this was known as Naku, in Japanese, it's Naku Gusukuwan. And the Americans changed the name to Buckner Bay so it can be visited by Americans today who visit Okinawa. On October 9th, the forecast was, by all natural law, a wind of 60 knots, 90 knots gusts in the early morning, and then it would pass away. However, Louise failed to conform to pattern, got larger, bigger, and in the evening, it actually went directly onto Okinawa, where all of the Americans were positioned, and this was the worst storm in American recorded naval history that the American forces had to contend with. The damage it left in its wake was tremendous. Almost all the food and medical supplies and other stores were destroyed. 80% of all housing and buildings knocked down, destroyed and rendered unusable, and all the military installations on the island were temporarily out of action. 60 planes taken away by the storm. Very little tentage was salvageable. What little was on hand was simply there because they were stocking up for previous storms. Food stocks were left for only 10 days. Medical facilities were so destroyed that the immediate request had to be made for hospital ships to support the shore damage and the activities on the island. If active hostilities had not ceased, if the Americans had been prepared for an invasion of Japan like they had been prepared for, they knew they would have lost double the men that the Mongols had lost. So we're talking about to confirm this, there were over 107 amphibious craft left by the invading forces, including 4 tank landing ships, 2 medium landing ships, a gunboat, and every single one of them were destroyed. 2 infantry landing craft included, and all of these were critical to the vanguard of what was the proposed invasion of Japan. It was so bad that the Americans on October 15th had to commence Operation Magic Carpet, a giant evacuation procedure which resulted in 7,500 injured men being processed back for return to the United States. So upon that, the Americans were very much convinced that occult forces could be controlled. This is what happened to carriers. United States American carriers were dragging anchor in Buckner Bay. That is how bad the winds were. They were pretty much immeasurable. They had never measured anything like them. And the Americans were convinced, because the Japanese had predicted it so completely, that the Japanese knew what they were doing. And the Americans wanted to learn how to do it. And the Japanese told them, well, these gods are native to our islands, and you can't utilize them. All you're going to call up are demons. And the Americans felt that that was a great bargain for the power that they could have to control the weather. And in terms of that, we go back to San Francisco. If Satan has a home, it's San Francisco, because it was the founding center for the Church of Satan under Anton LaVey. This is him giving a chalice of blood to Jane Mansfield, who later on ran for president on the satanic ticket. He also was very much in connection with Marilyn Monroe, who knew better than to have a photograph ever taken of herself. But he was quite notorious. He went to City College of San Francisco, where he majored in criminology. I also went to City College of San Francisco, where I majored in criminology, and his history at City College of San Francisco was quite well known. And so his Church of Satan was established on the Walpurgisnacht of 1966, the year I was born, just a few days before I was born on October 20th. This young man is Colonel Michael Aquino. He would be a lieutenant colonel during all of the years that I worked with him. This is a very poor photograph, but it's one of the few photographs from a newspaper clipping that I could find of him when he was a young man, serving his years in Vietnam. He served his time in Vietnam often dressed like that, as a satanic chaplain. And what he would tell the troops was, you don't call on God. In our case, you need to call on Satan. And one of the reasons for this was because there was an enormous change that was going on in the entire officer corps in Vietnam. This is where he served. He served in 3 CTZ. This is the 3rd combat zone of Vietnam. It's the South Vietnam. Would you see that title at the top? The section right below it is where he served. He served there for a year with the 6th Psi Ops Battalion, 3 Corps Tactical Zone. He was dealing in field experiments with amplified sound to disorient the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese. And what they were doing was broadcasting demonic screams from the helicopters that were flying overhead. Well, those helicopters kept getting shot down by RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. So they were having an enormous loss because the helicopters are clearly visible. They're broadcasting enormous sound. They're attracting all the attention in the world to themselves. They're nothing but flying targets. The Vietnamese were taking them down, and their rule of thumb was literally, if the helicopter is bigger than your thumb, you can hit it with an RPG. That's how easy it was for them. So his solution to it was to get the demonic screams to go over the heads of the VC and the North Vietnamese army and disorient them without the helicopters. So towards that end, he wrote what was known as the Diabolicon. The Diabolicon was taken so seriously by the Vietnamese that they actually raided his headquarters multiple times and lost hundreds of men to destroy it. There were several times during his service in Vietnam that it was more than half destroyed by enemy fire. What was the Diabolicon? The Diabolicon was a series of quatrains, poetic prose statements that were channeled through Lieutenant Colonel Aquino through 7 demonic entities. He lists them as the actual authors of the book. They are, as he lists them, Satan, Beelzebub, Azazel, Abaddon, Asmodeus, Azathoth. Astaroth would be a variant on that. Belial, Leviathan. And this is what led to his being accepted into the Church of Satan as a high priest by Anton LaVey when he came home. He returned in the summer solstice, June 1970. He was the advisor for a grade Z horror film called The Asylum of Satan. So that's one of the few trash horror flicks that you can rent that has a grade A ritual text. All of the rituals in that film are designed to work. So please be careful when you're looking at that DVD. So I give this advice out, don't let your children watch it. And I'm serious with this. This is nothing to play with. I have seen magic work. It is simply a technique, a kind of alternate technology, if you will, that works with a different level of physics. This is Anton LaVey, the young Anton LaVey, and the founder of the Church of Satan with one of their great converts, Sammy Davis Jr. And this is San Francisco with the San Francisco Presidio military base. So this is El Presidio Rio de San Francisco, 1,500 acres of land that was stolen from the American Indians. It was a Native American Indian tribal resting ground of the Ohlone, First Peoples Nation. It was originally stolen by the Spanish. It was a captaincy of the Spanish in 1776. So it's one of the oldest establishments in the United States, as old as anything on the East Coast. And later on, of course, it was the Area 51 of the United States during the World War I era. We're talking about maritime biplanes being launched off a little spit of sand known as Crissy Field, but they had the entire U.S. 6th Army stationed on base to protect them. So they were testing top secret planes. This is why later on Roswell documents were sent to the Presidio military base. The historical connection of aviation was still there. And so what we have is after this is the Presidio itself. It's very difficult to see this, but if you look at other maps of Presidio, you will ultimately be able to locate many of the facilities of which I speak. The Child Daycare Center will, of course, play prominently, the library where I worked at, and basically you'll be dealing with kind of a tour guide for yourself because it's an open base now, and you're free to visit these places and kind of absorb the energy, if you will, see what you can feel, see what kind of investigations you can dig up. Because one thing I can assure you, when the child molestation came down at the Presidio of San Francisco, where 500 kids, half a thousand kids were infested with AIDS, I was given direct orders to destroy maps of the underground tunnels that led from one facility to another. We're talking about ancient artillery batteries, if you can use the term ancient, a couple hundred years old, that got expanded and modernized into the World War II era. They were connected by underground tunnels to avoid blast. They were reinforced with lead later on to avoid atomic blast. And so we're talking about massive labyrinth exists beneath Presidio that connects one building to another. There are no maps to that labyrinth. I was given direct orders to destroy them all. Now, in terms of what happened afterwards, this is Anton LaVey at home. He is a neighbor of mine. He's not exactly next door, but we both live on Russian Hill. I actually know his street address. Obviously, for legal reasons, it's not something I'm going to give out. But he broke away from the Church of Satan because the Church of Satan was far more into a kind of hedonism, a worship of the self. What Aquino had found through the powers that he had garnished was that he was in connection with far darker sources. So what he had done was he had actually conducted what is known as a prerogative invocation. An evocation is the summoning of an entity. An invocation would be intimate communication with the entity. And he felt that he had summoned Satan himself under the guise of one of his original avatars, Set, or the Egyptian god of darkness. So that's hence the name Temple of Set, which is the name of his temple, which is still alive and well today and expanding internationally. His wife is beside him. Her name is Lilith. Behind them is an image of their god Set, or what we would know of as Satan. These are various ancient alphabets. This is a modern book, but these alphabets are derived from ancient manuscripts. One of the things I was assigned to as a military-based librarian as liaison to Colonel Aquino was to use the OCLC, the Online Cataloging and Library Cooperation Program, to find Lieutenant Colonel Aquino ancient grimoires from museums all over the United States or in the Commonwealth, and use this program to get direct orders to our Commonwealth allies, such as Canada or England, or to anywhere within the nation, saying that these grimoires were vital to national security and had to be utilized by the Defense Intelligence Agency. So as a librarian, I had to order these grimoires for him, make sure they arrived safely, because they are literally in refrigerated safes. And I would hold these moldering tomes in my hand, confirm them, make sure that they got to Lieutenant Aquino, and he had to conduct his rituals within the library itself because they could not leave the library. Absolutely could they not leave the library. So he invited his coven, and I never saw a member of his 12-member coven. He was number 13. Never saw a member who was beneath the rank of major. He very much had only high-level military officers working with him in the new science. Now, you may not notice this, but this was designed by Colonel Aquino himself, not the Great Seal of the United States, but the words he added onto it. At the top, the all-seeing eye is all other visible atoms. The rest of the pyramid is hydrogen and helium. Now, this was one of the feelings that he had had intuitively from his invocation of the satanic/Setian entity that he had summoned. And he knew this far before physicists were talking about such dark matter, because this is what he came up with. That little pyramid you see is almost nothing.
The rest of the universe is 4% invisible atoms, 25% cold dark matter, 70% dark energy, what he called the new order of the universe. Physicists are now confirming what this man knew intuitively from whatever entity he had summoned. He spoke of this to me. He gave me these documents for my own edification many, many years ago, before people started talking about dark matter in popular culture. And he explained the fact that his magic worked because it's always easier to reach down than it is to reach up. And there's so much dark energy around, he knew he was on the winning side as far as he was concerned. He could just take it, 0-point energy, free energy, that he could use at any time to get done what he wanted done. This is the Letterman Army Medical Center. Now, I myself had to go to Letterman Army Medical Center many times as a military dependent. 25% of all Army doctors were trained at Letterman Army Medical Center. So it was an enormous establishment. It is the first Army hospital, believe it or not, that ever existed in the United States. Until that time, what the U.S. had were field hospitals. They did not have structured Army hospitals throughout the Civil War. That was, anyone who tells you otherwise may be talking about like establishments of universities that the armies would take advantage of, etc. But no, this was actually the U.S. Army's first major structured hospital. It no longer exists. One of the reasons they tore it down is because very gruesome experiments were performed here on both man and beast. I had to deal with the experimental subjects because many of these were people from prison. They were given shortened sentences, revoked sentences. They were given pardons, full pardons if they would volunteer for experimentation. And while they were kept at Letterman Army Medical Center, I had to deal with giving them materials to read. As a Department of Defense librarian, they were spending months and months under experimentation. Some of them would be funny. They would be given 9 months of being fed nothing but salmon. Whether they're black or they're white, their skin would turn orange. And they had nothing to do but salmon burgers, salmon tofu. These men were going mad, but at least it was funny. I'll show you some photographs later on, which didn't turn out so funny. This is Dresden, and this is one of the fascinations of Lieutenant Colonel Aquino. The lay public really does not understand a lot of occult dynamics. Just as I was explaining about Japan, Japan's gods are not America's gods. Japan's supernatural forces that they're summoning are not those America can summon. But what happened at the Dresden firebombing was a fireball that was so massive that more people were killed and more damage was done than Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. And people might ask, what's the point of this tremendous loss of life? These are real people. These are not statues overlooking the city of Dresden. These are real people. And this is what Colonel Aquino was explaining to me. While the Americans ignored Japan, they had a Germany first policy, and they were desperately killing as many civilians as they could to summon entities. By opening a portal with all of that life energy, they had to kill as many people as they could to get this portal opened. And I was saying, why were you so desperate that this needed to be done? He said, well, you don't understand. The Nazis themselves had concentration camps where they were killing millions of people so that they could summon and invoke the old gods of the Norse and the Teutonic tribes, Thor, Woden, all of the rest of these gods that you're familiar with from grade school. And I said, well, how are these gods a threat to you? And he said, mass sacrifice brings entities back. You would not believe it, but paganism would be a major religion today in Germany if we hadn't done what we had done. And I said, well, what have you accomplished? Well, we brought forth entities that we now have to control, that we now have to contain, that we now have to feed. We have to keep these wars going. This is Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons worked for NASA. And Jack Parsons himself is an interesting character. He basically was born in World War I. And basically, he used to go to Devil's Gate Arroyo, and he would fire test rockets. He is the only black magician, a confirmed alchemist, who has a crater on the moon named after him, fittingly on the dark side of the moon, Crater Parsons. But after he was shooting off rockets at Devil's Gate Arroyo by day, he performed rites of sex magic and invocation as the head of the Los Angeles Agape Lodge of Aleister Crowley's OTO. Aleister Crowley, of course, is British, but the OTO was international, Ordo Templi Orientalis. And as a member of Agape Lodge, Jack Parsons and his friends would hold nightly orgies to call up various satanic entities. And one such house guest who joined them at Agape Lodge was none other than L. Ron Hubbard. And L. Ron Hubbard basically convinced Jack Parsons, who's actually there on the right of that photo, he convinced him that we had to call up the whore of Babylon and we can give birth to the Antichrist if you consummate a physical relationship with her. So with L. Ron Hubbard acting as the scryer, Parsons invoked to summon the spirit of the whore of Babylon in a major working in the Mojave Desert. This becomes important with some of the military bases where I was taken to by Lieutenant Colonel later on in my career as his aide. But where he summoned up the whore of Babylon in January 18th, 1946, a young woman named Marjorie Cameron responded, literally walking out of the desert. And it's very difficult to find any past on this woman. We know her name. We don't really know other than that. Some people might be able to find out something from the police records. I worked with a criminology department in San Francisco. I've got a degree in criminal psychology. I don't know much about her, that anything that anyone knows in terms of police records or anything else. But she wound up consummating with Jack Parsons, and while she was doing that, L. Ron Hubbard ran off with Jack Parsons' life savings and his wife. In the meantime, they gave birth to a tremendously twisted, deformed young child that died at childbirth. That much was medically confirmed. That much everyone knew. But his name was Moonchild. And years later, while I was dealing with Colonel Aquino as his aide, back in those days, before we had cell phones, before we had the internet, you used to take calls. And I used to take calls for him as a lieutenant colonel. And one of the people I had to take calls from was Moonchild. And this individual at the other end of the line said, "This is Moonchild. I need to talk to Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino." And I'd say, "Well, he's busy right now. I'll go get him. I'll see if he's available." Lieutenant Colonel Aquino always answered. And I said, "Is that the Moonchild?" And he says, "Yes, that's the Moonchild." And I said, "Well, what are you doing with him?" And he says, "He's working with us on ushering in the age of the Antichrist. Someday you'll have the privilege of meeting Moonchild if you ever join me in my community." And later on, when I had to wait for about maybe a good 15 minutes for Colonel Aquino to come, I had to entertain Moonchild at the other end of the line. I never met him personally. But I asked him, there's an urban legend about the birth of Marjorie Cameron being a deformed child who died at the moment of conception. And he says, "Yes, that was my twin brother." And he said, however, I sapped all of his energy in the womb. And I said, "Well, that's an enormous claim to make, and I want to ask him more about it." But Colonel Michael Aquino walked in and took the call after that. Well, at any rate, by 1948, Jack Parsons had lost his Navy security clearance, which meant he was out of his Caltech job. And so at that point, he declared himself Beleriand Armilus El Dejal Antichrist, wrote the Book of the Antichrist. The following year, in 1950, he was fired from Hughes Aircraft for stealing confidential documents. In the Aerojet Israeli deal, he sold a bunch of confidential secrets to Israel, of all places. And on June 17th, 1952, he died in a mysterious mercury fulminate explosion, which Colonel Aquino claimed that he had helped to organize. And I said, "Well, that's impossible. That was years before you were born, wasn't it?" And he said, "No, don't you understand? I was born on October 16th, 1946, while all of the defenders at the Nuremberg trial were being hung." And he said, "My kind of occultism was such that I was intuitively blessed with this kind of skill, even while I was a national commander of the Eagle Scouts." Matter of fact, that's where he met Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. Both of them were Eagle Scouts. So, at any rate, this is Wewelsburg Castle. This is where Heinrich Himmler of the SS was trying to coordinate the ushering in of the old gods, of the Teutonic Norse gods, to come back to walk the earth once more. And this is where Lieutenant Colonel Aquino gained enormous notoriety. He was in service with the World Affairs Council due to his enormous level of security clearances. And he was put on second mint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. October 19th to 20th, which just happens to be my birthday, in 1983, he entered the Hall of the Slain, where Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler and his SS officers were trying to coordinate the summoning through the sacrifice of millions of lives at Auschwitz, Dachau, various other concentration camps, and bring back the elderly gods of the Norse mythology. Michael Aquino entered there as a NATO officer and used his pulled rank, commandeered the place, basically hijacked it, conducted an enormously obscene ritual of supposition and binding in which he was trying to prevent the gods from ever breaking through. He felt that the magic the Nazis had wielded was so strong that the gods would eventually break through. That symbol on the floor is the symbol of the black sun. And when people ask about why the Nazis had such advanced physics in terms of being able to build the Hanabu, various other anti-gravitic vehicles like the Bell that later on fell at Kecksburg but was originally known as simply the Nazi Bell, that comes from the concept of the black sun. What happened was an Asian Indian scientist by the name of Chandrasekhar, Subhas Chandrasekhar, had discovered the concept of the black hole in 1937. When he presented this to the British as an Asian Indian member of the British Commonwealth, the British just called him a yellow nigger. But the Germans, on the other hand, and the Japanese both considered themselves Aryans, and they considered their origin root race to be the Iranians and Northern Asian Indians, who were the original Aryan cradle of civilization. The Japanese felt that there was a maritime exodus to Japan, which gave them their Aryan bloodline, and the Germans felt that there was an overland exodus to Northern Europe, where the Germans had their Aryan bloodline. But they both took Asian Indian science seriously. So when Subhas Chandrasekhar said there are black holes, the Germans actually used Konrad Zus's calculator and computator. He invented the world's first primitive computer to confirm the Chandrasekhar equations, and they confirmed the existence of black holes 40 years before the Americans and the British even knew of them. And by this, they calculated in the center of our galaxy is a supermassive black hole, Die Schwarzensohn, or the black sun, around which the rest of the galaxy evolves because of gravity and revolves around because of gravity. That is where the black sun symbol of the galaxy comes from, and this is the explanation behind the 40-year jump in Nazi science and Japanese science. And it was this kind of threat that Colonel Aquino never wanted discovered. He wanted it hidden. He got on national TV and was talking about the threat of it, and people couldn't even understand what he was saying because of their lack of education in occult matters. Usually he got branded as a neo-Nazi. But in terms of all of this, in no way, shape, or form am I commending him or making him the hero. I'm simply showing there are other sides. There are other magics. There are other reality filters. And depending on which reality filter you use, it depends on what kind of science develops. And this is Fort Irwin. Fort Irwin is out in the middle of BF nowhere. And Fort Irwin is the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert between Nevada and California. And it's as big as Rhode Island in terms of landmass. And I will guarantee you one thing, all credit to the Army. Where I experienced Desert Shield, Desert Storm, our training in the deserts, I wasn't with the Army, I was a Marine, but our training as a nation in that desert is what led to a 44-day victory on the ground, thanks to what was done at Fort Irwin. There is no denying the conventional common sense of training for desert warfare in a condition that is in many ways worse than what was confronted in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, this is where Jack Parsons used to conduct his rituals. So this is where our colonel brought me several times when he was trying to convert me for reasons that I will eventually go into. Now, there was someone else he worked with. This actually has text on it. Hopefully it's legible. One of a series of communication satellites launched by NASA in the 1960s. Each spent several years in low Earth orbit and would have looked to the naked eye like a bright, moving star. But this was known in Army circles as Project Lucifer, son of the morning star. And our friend Colonel Aquino pushed it through a kind of high-grade moron by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon was in Vietnam for 5 months. He was the only platoon leader in a battalion left alive after 5 months. And this goes to why there are so many Satanists in the military. People ask, well, how could this happen? We're a Christian nation. What happened to all these good old boys, the salt of the earth from World War II? Well, they got fragged. Frag is a term for men who kill their officers. Now, during the time of the Vietnam War, we had an enormous stress. As a Marine, I can tell you that statistically, even though you were drafted, and you could be drafted into the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, a lot of people don't know that you would spend 3 months in training, you'd go for 9 months, like childbirth, to Vietnam. And during that period of time, helicopters would fly you every day from battle zone to battle zone. So in 9 months' time, your Marine would see more combat than a U.S. Marine would see in 5 years of World War II. Statistically, that's accurate. This is why men were breaking in Vietnam. You get the World War II generation, and they're saying, we're the greatest generation. We fought a real war. They're talking about like, oh, I was at EWO. These battles were massive. They were tremendous. There's no denying the valor of the Marine Corps. But you would have months and months while they're preparing for the next invasion. These islands were not close to each other. And during that off time, Marines got to relax. They got a time to recover. That did not exist in Vietnam. Every day you were in combat. This is why they all came home, Army, Vietnam, or other services, so altered, so changed, so susceptible to what Colonel Aquino had to say. And what about their officers, the men who were to lead them? Well, Long Binh Jail, LBJ is what everyone called it in South Vietnam. LBJ, Long Binh Jail, was site of the largest race riots in American prison history. That's right, the largest race riots in American prison history did not take place in the United States. They took place at LBJ in Vietnam. And who was in most of those prisons and military brig? Men who fragged their officers. How many officers were fragged? 20,000. Vietnam was the most dangerous war in the history of mankind for an officer. And anyone who doubts that, let me put it into perspective for you. 1968, you had 600,000 men, well over 500,000 men in Vietnam. You multiply them by the length of the war, even if you're very conservative, 11 years, say you take a few years away, you're left with around 10 million men serving in Vietnam. And for a fact, I know it was higher than that, more like 12 to 13 million. 20,000 men dead out of that. It's a very small percentage of men. But in terms of officers, that's a lot. And in terms of what happened socially in terms of that, what did you see? You saw a lot of these Christian officers go by the wayside and new men filled their place. Men appointed by men like Aquino. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon, a guy whose father went to West Point, but he flunked his appointment because he couldn't pass the English exam. But he majored in art in ROTC. So what was he? He was Colonel Aquino's battering ram. Whereas Colonel Aquino could appear on national TV dressed as a priest of the Temple of Set, and he could go around in full uniform on duty with his face clipped, eyebrows clipped, the 666 tattooed on his scalp. He did have that. He could wear the widow's peak, all the rest of that. Freedom of religion, that's what the Constitution protects. But he couldn't appear on air in uniform. Channon could, and Channon did, supporting the Church of Satan, and later Temple of Set, and later the Wicca Battalion, known as 1st Earth Battalion. And 1st Earth Battalion, thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon's stationing in Fort Lewis near Seattle, where high technology test beds were being developed, he was able to get assigned to the unit designated to test new equipment and ideas developed by Task Force Delta. What is Task Force Delta? Task Force Delta is the Army think tank of officers, futurists, psychologists that study critical personnel problems. Because in 1979, after the Vietnam War, that's exactly what you had. Enormous personnel problems. Nobody was going to sign up for the Army. So they said, well, what do we do? Well, let's get all these specialists together in Task Force Delta. By the way, I need to emphasize, I can't overemphasize this strongly enough, this is not to be confused with Delta Force. Delta Force is a group of honorable men who were disastrously misdeployed in the desert in an attempt to rescue the American hostages by Jimmy Carter. I can guarantee you they were sabotaged. There is no way on earth that you have helicopters crash into each other, fall out of the sky in totality as they did with Delta Force. And that unit was almost wiped out thanks to that kind of sabotage. And the sabotage behind that is a totally different story, has nothing to do with Satanism, more to deal with CIA intervention, and ultimately Reagan becoming president. Nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I don't want Delta Force confused with Task Force Delta. But Task Force Delta is an official Army unit. They're an enormous organization. They utilize DeltaNet, the official Army computer network, the official designator of the U.S. Army. Delta Force Computer Conference and Electrical Mail Network has over 1,000 members. That was back when I worked at DOD. Yeah, and they call themselves the Tribe. This was a very, very sinister term that I was going to learn later on had to deal with child trafficking. But the Tribe always referred to a kind of inversion of the tribes of Israel, and they called themselves the 13th tribe, or the lost tribe, was how they would refer to themselves as. Now, James Channon, who I mentioned, who's part of this, he got lent out on official, in full uniform. He got lent out officially to at least a dozen government agencies during the time that I had to work with Aquino. This included the LAPD. This included the Seattle Police Department. And he got there so he could proselytize First Earth Battalion concepts on TV and national radio as well in full uniform. And so, at any rate, at the charter initiation of Task Force Delta, this was in their at the charter initiation of the First Earth Battalion of Wicca, or Warlocks, this was at the second quarterly meeting of Task Force Delta in 1980 at the U.S. Army War College Officers Club at Fort Leavenworth. They conducted their initiation ritual around a candle and, fittingly, a dollar bill. Think back to that symbol that I showed you earlier about Aquino's model of the universe. At any rate, they incorporated it as a monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, private and nonprofit, so that the Army could have plausible deniability. But both West Point and the Command and Staff College, they include the First Earth Battalion curricula in their human relations courses. And this is a lot of what happened to the Army, is you get this kind of human relations for the Army. I've got an actual official Army manual at home that is sold at any post exchange in the United States called Military Operations Other Than War. Now, what on earth would a military exist for other than war? Well, there's Meals on Wheels programs to other ethnic groups. There's all these kinds of very bizarre social programs where they become social engineers. You can thank First Earth Battalion for that. If your Army has stopped killing things and breaking people and demolishing buildings and has become this kind of like diplomats in uniform and Meals on Wheels services and meal drop services the world over, you can thank a lot of the First Earth Battalion reconstruction for that. But at any rate, in terms of the officers in the network, at the time that I worked with the Department of Defense, there were over 800. They distributed all of these materials via the chain of the command. There were 2 4-star generals that I know of. One of them was General Bob Shoemaker. He called Jim Channon the Army's leading futurist and the First Earth Battalion warrior monk, satanic warrior monk, as a model for the future. And the first thing he did that when he became Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense I'm trying to figure out when he became Deputy Chief of Staff, it's been a long time, when 4-star General Bob Shoemaker became Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. First thing he did was he organized Task Force Delta as a conference to draw up an organizational plan for training all of the leaders in the U.S. Military under 1st Earth Battalion auspice. And this was presented to the General Staff, and they thought it was great. Well, how can that be possible? Well, one reason why, aside from him, there was another 4-star general whose name was, what was his name? I'm trying to remember now, but at any rate, it was Glenn K. Otis. That was it. It was Glenn K. Otis. Then there were 6 major generals: Sam Wetzel, Dale Vesser, Bob Moore, Jack Merritt, James Ellis, Bob Elton. There were 3 brigadier generals. There were Alan Omo, Hardin Olson, and Rick Brown. And just with that kind of brass, everything that they wanted to get done got done, much to the detriment of the military, much to the detriment of the security of the United States. So what do these satellites do? What does the Son of the Morning Star do that is so bad that makes it such a great thing to them? Well, one of the things that it does is it channels and directs, in a physics sense, not in an occult sense, channels and directs microwave energy being pulsed from HAARP. And when I originally had to work with investigating HAARP, because that was one of the things that was done after the Presidio child abuse scandal, was I was sent off base and told that I would get a higher security clearance if I could find out what HAARP was all about. And HAARP, by the way, stands for High Frequency Activated Auroral Atmospheric Resonance Research Projection Program. A lot more complicated than what people think. So when I was investigating HAARP, I was told to go to Sonoma State, and they said there's this thing called Project Censored, which is still in business today. If you go to Sonoma State, that course is ongoing. It's there for journalism majors to teach them investigative journalism and bring out the best in them. So who funds Project Censored? People like Ted Koppel, John McLaughlin, big names in the industry fund Project Censored at Sonoma State University. And their job is to find out underreported stories and break them. So they said, Dietrich, we want you to find out what these journalism students are finding out about what we're doing. So when I was infiltrating Project Censored as a Sonoma State student for a year, I found out that HAARP was about basically channeling EMP, or a steady pulsation, from the Gakona, Alaska region to the North Korean peninsula with a chain of lucifers. And by doing that, they managed to deplete all of the mineral content out of North Korean soil, so they suffered from a 15-year drought. This 15-year drought has, since that time, resulted in over 1 million North Koreans dead. Any crab fisherman, any fishery in Gakona, Alaska will tell you every once in a while they'll find broken fragments of Scud missiles because the North Koreans try to launch Scud missiles to take down HAARP. And they can't get through because the HAARP EMP is so powerful, it's its own defense mechanism, and it scrambles the electronic brains and circuitry of these Scud missiles, and they explode in midair before they can even reach the facility. Alaska is under attack, and Alaskans don't know it. And it's under attack because it's essentially the launching pad for genocide. Now, this is kind of brings it closer to home. And one of the things that I asked in terms of getting back to Colonel Aquino, when I came back from Sonoma State, by the way, the U.S. government shafted me on all my student loans, and I never got that security clearance. So when I got back and I was talking to Lieutenant Colonel Aquino, and I was asking him, well, what was that all about? And he said, well, we had to get you off base after what had happened. And I'll go into that in a minute. That's where the dog leads into. But that was the Presidio child abuse scandal where I managed to save the colonel's ass because quite legally and quite realistically, Colonel Aquino had nothing to do with child molestation on the Presidio military base. Certainly not physically. And I know that for a fact because it was my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright. And Gary Willard Hambright, I helped to get him arrested. Go into that story in a moment. That was all proven in court. He ultimately died of AIDS while on trial, but too late for 500,000 kids who he had infected with AIDS. But they had basically pointed to Colonel Aquino. And Colonel Aquino was never physically anywhere near the sites where the children were being molested. I was able to verify that and prove it. The devil's gratitude is nothing to be taken lightly, but of course he always felt so gracious to me after that. He wanted me to be on his team. So one time he took me down to Santa Fe, New Mexico to see the 1st Earth Battalion in action. And instead of a reveille where these guys are waking up to a bugle, these guys are waking up to primal scream. And then they do yoga. And then after that, they get on and put on the war paint, and they put on the feathers, and they do these chants and these seances and all this other crap. And I've got a quote here from one of them, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. This is like a quote from Colonel Mike Maloney, Colonel, one of the tribal elders of the 1st Earth Battalion. Now, this was in Task Force Delta's 1982 meeting at the U.S. Army War College. He repeated the theme of what goes on at the Santa Fe, New Mexico monastery, where I had the misfortune of having to spend a few nights. He said, I am one of the tribal elders. My name is the Mullet Man. I am known as the one who casts nets. And I try to tell people of all those who cast nets, most should be concerned with the catching. Be careful what you catch. But some, at least, should focus more on the casting than the catching. I live with, fish for, and push the cause of the mullet, because he is a low-class fish. He is simple. He is honest. He moves around in great formations and columns. He does damn near all the work, but he is also noble. He is, in many ways, like another noble thing that I once loved and worked with, called soldier. And he got a standing ovation for this drug-addled drivel. So anyone who doubts what your officers are doing in terms of why your troops are getting killed in Afghanistan, why your troops are getting killed in Iraq, look on this and think of the Mullet Man, and think of your leadership, and shudder when you sleep at night. So I was over there in Santa Fe, and I had the dubious honor of meeting Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon. So he's explaining to me while I'm looking at all these guys going around in the sweat lodges and the war paint, on amphetamines, by the way. Speed them up. Ginseng tea, lots of ginseng tea. So he says, we've got the rainbow warrior we're cultivating. And I said, does this have to do with don't ask, don't tell? He said, no, you don't understand. See, the blacks, they give us soul. And the browns, they give us heart. And the reds, they give us grace. And the whites, they give us vision. And the yellows, they give us balance. So I turned to Colonel Aquino and I said, well, my mom's half Chinese, half Japanese, and my dad, he's half German and half Irish. What do you expect me to bring to this? He says, well, I was hoping you could bring some brains. And so this is the kind of what we're working with. But to get back to the ugliness, the seriousness, Presidio military base. This is a skinned dog. Its sexual organs have been removed. I can guarantee you all its blood has been removed. Letterman Army Medical Center again, because it takes medical equipment to do that. And I can guarantee you, this isn't the BS given to you by Ron Johnson and these other guys talking about the men who stare at goats. One of the theses behind that occult film, which just turns everything into a big joke, is, hey, dogs, they're man's best friend. The soldiers couldn't bear to kill them. Oh, that's why we had to turn to its goats, because they look kind of like the devil. Well, as the totemic animal of the dark forces, of Baal and Baphomet, and Satyr and Pan, and all of the divinities which were worshipped by the officer class of the Presidio military base, I can guarantee you there wasn't a single goat killed in the Presidio military base. They were killing dogs by the thousands. They were testing machine guns. They were testing sonic waves. They were testing microwaves. They were blowing them up with poison bullets, explosive bullets, everything you can imagine. That was dog killing central. And people were protesting. There were many people trying to block any entrance to the Presidio military base, what was going on at Letterman Army Medical Center. Well, this is some of the results. And believe me when I tell you, Colonel Aquino was insistent. Every single one of these is a sacrifice. None of these goes wasted. This is just wax. This was used in a ceremonial ritual so that they could direct their powers against the hands that offended them. I remember a ritual that was taking place in the library at one time where I was destroying documents. I always had the night shift. I've worked night shift all of my life. And I was responsible for document destruction on the base of San Francisco. I destroyed literally thousands and thousands of documents, far more than I could count. And our incinerator was vast. You could fit a person into it. And that's exactly what fell into it at one point, 10 years before I worked there. A guy who was pig-faced drunk fell in, burned an enormous part of his body, 75 to 90%. Well, he died. And one of the reasons he caught on fire so easily was because his uniform was saturated in alcohol. Well, mine never was. And it was dirty work. It's degrading work. They made me work the ovens. Well, Kino loved to do the rituals while I was working the ovens because I made the environment of the library feel like it was hell. Because the temperature went way up, and it made it conducive to what he was summoning. And I can tell you for a fact, one time, something that he summoned, I used to always laugh when I was a kid at the Ten Commandments because I hated that cheesy scene where Moses calls on the angel of death, and everything on the screen has this little black amoeba that's coming over everything, and it's just blacking out all of the whatever you can see, and everybody's firstborn son is being left dead, and I kept saying to myself, what crappy special effects. But what I can tell you is when he and his 12 officers were summoning the angel of death so they could point it with this hand, this wax hand as a focus, what I can guarantee you is what I saw was that his voice amplified and became the voice of 12 men. And the voices of those 12 men became the one voice of Colonel Aquino. They exchanged voices. And I saw this happen before it went dark. And people would ask me when I described this, do you mean the lights went out? Do you mean they didn't? I said, no, the lights didn't go dim. It went black. I just mean something black entered that room, entered the library, and the lights could not penetrate it. I don't know if you can understand the horror of having that happen and then in the dark hearing 12 men's voices issue from one man and one man's voice issuing from 12. But that's nothing. This is one of the prisoners, a result from the Letterman Army Medical Center. He died screaming. His records disappeared. I worked with personnel records with Letterman Army Medical Center because I had to make sure no personnel records went into the Department of Defense library, the main post library where you kept unit records. Where you kept unit records, you didn't want unit records going into personnel records. And these are photos that I took myself with a black and white camera that I had left over from my criminal science days back at City College of San Francisco. And I learned criminal photography technique in my criminology courses, just like Anton LaVey did. Anton LaVey, the head of the Church of Satan, his original career for a while in San Francisco was forensic photography. So I knew how to sneak this out. But this is not wax. This is a correct summoning pentagram. The circle is closed. The lines are defined. Because it's something I took a long time ago with a black and white photographic camera that I could hide. It looks like hell, to use a pun. But in terms of its ritualism, it's sound. One time, probably the worst experience I ever had in my life was when his 12 officers of his coven came without him, without adult supervision, so to speak. And they decided they were going to perform a ritual using a circle to summon something that would give them the ability to fire in the dark. These guys had M16s. Just to explain this to all of you, the modern M16, this knockoff, this piece of crap that's issued to your troops, what I used when I was a Marine, M16A1 Armalite assault rifle, is a Mott block plastic piece of crap. And it is worthless. As soon as you can, if you manage to find an AK-47 off of anyone who's dead, you grab that and you throw your M16 away. But the point was, how did we wind up with that? Was because in Vietnam, the original M16 rifle still had a kick. And geniuses like McNamara said, hey, the average Vietnamese soldier is too small to take that kick. We've got to make something that provides no kick. So the original M16s, which had wooden stocks, were all shelved. And they wound up at storage facilities like the ammo depot at the Presidio military base. These were at least usable weapons. They were meant to work. But after McNamara got through with his defense contractors, he did indeed, this is not urban legend, because I burned the records concerning it, he contracted Mattel Toys to make a toy rifle for the Vietnamese. And it works in the sense that you can hold an M16 rifle butt up to your nose and fire it full auto, and your nose will feel nothing. There is no kick. And the damage coming out of the other end is equally minimal, I assure you. If you get hit, if you have the luck of hitting somebody's ribs, it'll probably bounce off. But at any rate, so they grabbed a bunch of the wooden stocked M16s, and they were experimenting with full auto flash suppressors and silencers. A silencer is a disposable instrument. You use it once, and you throw it away. An assassin, a hitman in a major urban area, it makes a sound like, which is nothing. In a major city, anybody hears in an alley. Nobody even bats an eye. But you use it, you throw it away. Silencer is one use. Full auto silencer is also disposable, has a slower rate of decay, so it chortles. So they had all of these experimental full auto silencers they wanted to test. So they didn't want people to see them in the daytime with this joy firing on the range. So, and by the way, what is a range in the Presidio military base? There is no range on the Presidio military base. Even the San Francisco Police Department has its own firing range. The military doesn't, not at the Presidio. So they use the playground. Well, there's nobody there at night at the playground. It's nighttime, I'm on night shift. These guys are going to test these silencers. So what do? They got a bunch of these life-size, childlike paramedic stalls that are used to practice child CPR on. And they strung them up on the swings. And they're at the other end of the Presidio Park, and they're saying, well, we can't hit these at night, so we'll call on an entity from this circle that'll imbue the weapons with power so we can hit them. So they scratched with their blades, their bayonets, these pentagrams onto the wooden butts of their rifles to match the pentagram that you see up there. And they each performed a blood sacrifice, a ritual using some of their own blood. They were probably pig-faced drunk, so probably a lot more blood came out than they wanted. And so they used that to blood the pentagram. Well, You couldn't hear them because it was silent, but I knew what they were doing, and I couldn't do anything to stop them. They're officers. But anyhow, they're chortling happily away, blowing away these little child CPR dolls hung up on swings, just ripping them to shreds at night. Physically impossible to hit that at that range. But they were doing it. And suddenly, while I'm working with the incinerator, I felt cold. If you ever worked with an incinerator like I have, you're covered in black soot, you're hot, you're sweating, it's unbearable for most people. You build up a tolerance. But suddenly I'm working with this, and I went cold. And it's not just cold in the air. Everything inside me, I lost all empathy. It's like any sense of warmth, any sense of love I had for my mother and my father, or petting a kitten, or touching anybody. All of that was gone. I didn't feel anything. And I knew something had gone terribly, terribly wrong, cosmically wrong. And I went outside, and I went past these 12 officers who are firing full auto in the dark. And this is what I found. And when I checked out their blood at pentagram, I said, "You effed up." And they said, "What? What do you mean?" I said, "The circle's not closed. The circle's broken. Something's broken through." And I turned back and I looked at them, and all of their eyes were glowing. 12 men in full uniform in the dark, every single one of them with glowing eyes. Every single one of them had their M16s pointed at me. And I wasn't afraid because I wasn't feeling anything. I didn't feel anything. And when I turned around, they said, "Well, if we kill you, then maybe it'll be satisfied and go back." And I said, "No, you don't understand. That'll feed it." And I said, "You really have to come with me so we can fix this. Don't you feel it?" And I don't think they ever felt anything, because they don't feel anything when it's missing. And so I said, "Something's terribly wrong, and if you kill me, your careers will be impacted." And that stopped them. Then they put their guns down, and they're still looking at me with these glowing eyes, and they said, "But it works so well, our weapons are firing so well, we're hitting everything in the dark." I said, "It's not the weapons, it's you. It's inside of you." And so I said, "Get back into the library. We're going to find something." Now, I'm born in Asia. I am not a Christian. And I said, "We've got to do something to revoke this." And they said, "Well, fuck, you," I'm sorry, said, "You believe in Buddha, you believe in all this crap, why don't you call something up to put it back?" And I said, "It's not like that. There's 12 of you and there's one of me. We have to go old school. We're going to find a Bible." And I'll be damned. We tore that place inside out. Presidio Military Base Library. There was no effing Bible. And I said, "Find a Book of Mormon. Find something." And there's no Book of Mormon. There's nothing. There is nothing that was holy in that library. And I said, "The children's room. We got to go to the children's room." We went to the children's room. And there was this little child's Bible where Jesus is smiling like a toothpaste commercial. And I said, "Just do what I'm doing." And I got down and just said the Lord's Prayer. That's the only thing I knew, because my dad was a Catholic. He was Caucasian, and he was as Catholic. So I just said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And it was just so hard. And we couldn't get it out. I said, "Cross the pentagrams off the butts of your rifles. Draw a cross. Scrape off the pentagram." And they couldn't do it. They just trying, and they couldn't even move. It's like they're underwater. And then I'm grabbing it, and I'm helping them, and we're just scraping. We're on our knees, and we're just straining with every effort, every fiber of our being. And we're finally able to do this with 12 effing buttstocks. We get these pentagrams scraped off. We get these little crucifixes back on, these real crude crucifixes. And we start going back to the Lord's Prayer again. And I'm just saying, "Forgive us, forgive us. We lost children. Forgive us, forgive us, forgive us." And we're just going through this, and it's just so hard. It's like we were going to vomit. It's just, everything just felt so horrible. It was just, something was like cotton was in our mouths. It was like we literally could not talk. And then finally, after doing this 100 times, something left us. And whatever it was that left us, it was so vast, I know it took something with it. Like some kind of tumorous cancer that you have to remove a bit of the organ with. And I know that day I lost something. And I have no idea what it was. I don't know what it was because I can't remember it. I think it was a happy memory. Something, some empathic moment, some happy memory was taken from me with that entity leaving that I will never retrieve. And we all fell on the floor, just exhausted, just collapsed, just sweating profusely. Some of the guys started vomiting, and I myself thought I was going to vomit. I was just dry heaving. And it was just after that incident that I said, get the damn rifles back in the ammo dump so no one knows what happened. And even though people found that, this is the tragedy of the Presidio military base, they found that the next day, that was so common, it didn't mean anything. Kids went to play in that playground the next day and had seen stuff like that so often, nobody questioned it. But in terms of what happened that day and what I began to realize is that magic is a technique. And what it takes is enough belief from enough people to harness it. This is Colonel Aquino now. He's retired with his wife Lilith. And one of the reasons he was able to reach this happy state was thanks to my saving his butt when it came to the child molestation scandal at the Presidio military base, which I'm going to try to get into right now and cover as quickly as possible. It's very hard to cover. It's very gruesome to cover. But what had happened was that when I started working at the Presidio military base in 1984, at the ripe old age of about 17 years of age, I was a librarian's aide. And eventually what I became was a full-blown military reference technician. But at that time, my high school teacher, Gary Hambright, who taught at John O'Connell Vocational Institute of Technology. It was a vocational school, not a high school, but it took up a person's high school years. It was renowned all over the world as San Quentin Prep. At that point, it was so full of gangs and violent teachers as well that there's practically no one who ever gave it any credit. No one was ever hired. In other words, the job of a vocational school is to get you employed as soon as you graduate. No one was ever employed graduating from John O'Connell that I know of. But at any rate, I was there majoring in commercial illustration. And when I majored in commercial illustration, it opened up a lot of doors for me because I did some cartoons for the Star Presidian, the military base newspaper. And I was invited on the basis of that to San Francisco as a city of consulates to work for the Iraqi consulate before they were considered America's enemies. I actually spent some time in Iraq doing propaganda posters for the Saddam Hussein regime when he was our ally during the Iran-Iraq war. I write about that on my website, the story behind that. Of course, all the kids who put it up for me for free, you get what you pay for. They were all doing bong rips. They spell Iraqi like it's an Indian tribe. So I apologize for that. Hasn't got the best spelling in the world, but you're free to read about that story later on at douglasdietrich.com. But the point is, my high school teacher from there, who was a full-blown pedophile, he was a sworn, ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. It must be emphasized, he was without a pulpit. He lived in a church in San Francisco because he was essentially homeless, couldn't keep his child porn there, so he kept it at John O'Connell at the Vocational Institute on school property as art reference so that people could draw children. And so he got away with that. To show you what I was going to say San Quentin, to show you what John O'Connell was like, he got away with that for years. And then he ran the daycare center at the Presidio military base. So this dude winds up at its, let me see if I can remember this. At its maximum, the daycare center could hold maybe about 300 kids, 250 children, I believe. Yeah, it was 250 children were the maximum the children's daycare center at the Presidio military base could handle. That's an enormous amount of children. 250 children is enormous. And but over many years, while Gary Hambright was working there, it dwindled down to 180 because children were getting so traumatized they couldn't return. Beyond that, they were coming home with every STD imaginable. They were coming down with chlamydia. They were coming down with venereal. They were coming down with herpes zoster. Worse yet, they came down HIV. And so everybody began to investigate. And what happened at the investigation was it became a circus. You had the FBI, had the San Francisco Police Department, had the CID, the Criminal Investigations Division of the team from the 6th Army of the United States Army, of course, that was headquartered at Presidio, headed by the JAG. So all of this was just leading nowhere. And so I pointed out Gary Hambright's, because one reason it was leading nowhere was because they were pursuing the wrong man. They raided his home. As I said, he lives practically next door to me. Thank God not literally, but on Russian Hill as I do. But it was, I'm trying to remember the inspector's name, but the person who raided him, his home, is not nearly as important as Sandy Gallant. The chief investigator of his case was Sergeant Sandy Gallant, Gallant. She was a specialist in satanic crime. She had dealt with occult crime in San Francisco before. She was familiar enough with the occult like voodoo Santeria, where when a headless body was found in Golden Gate Park with a chicken's head stuck on top of it, she gave the exact date when someone would break into the morgue to try and reunite the missing head with the body, and she predicted right on the money. After that, she became nationally renowned as an investigator in satanic crime. And she was hot on Aquino, and she said, oh, we've got to stop that. And I told her, look, it's not Aquino. Said, it's Gary Hambright. He's got his child porn over there at the John O'Connell. They investigated. They found out it was true. And at that point, it became San Francisco Police Department jurisdiction. And they were able to kick out the FBI, the provost marshal of the Presidio military base and all that, go into Presidio, take Gary Hambright out in handcuffs. But they were waiting a few days before they jumped him. They didn't want to jump him on base, wanted to jump him at home. So I saw that guy one last time taking the bus from the Presidio military base to up Russian Hill, where I live, and where Aquino lives. And he was taking it to go, God knows where, probably down to the financial district from the Presidio. Back in those days, buses used to go into the Presidio. Now they have shuttles. So I got on the bus with him. I says, hey, here you lost your job over at the daycare center. He had no idea I'd fingered him. He said, I didn't lose my job. I quit. I said, well, what you going to do now? He looked at me with this. He was drinking a bottle of grape juice. He looked at me with this big cheese-eating grin with all these purple teeth. And he said, you know, I really want to get into politics. That was the last time I ever saw him. Then later on, when he was on TV, on trial, a friend of mine said, he's in politics now, up to his ass. But at any rate, sadly, January 1990, not sadly because of him, sadly because of the repercussions, implications, he died of AIDS. And of course, it turned out all of these children had been infected with such. And what the U.S. Army responded to was they burned the daycare center down and all of the records inside of it. This was a $50,000 arson. It took place on the autumnal equinox, September 22nd, 1987. The community services building was adjacent to the Presidio Daycare Center. And right behind that was the military intelligence building where Colonel Aquino ran systems analysis for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. And they were all connected by underground tunnel systems. And that's when the order came down to me, Dietrich, you burn those records of that tunnel system. And I burned them. But then what happened was, at that time of the investigation, the BATF got involved, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and they said it was arson. The U.S. Army simply denied it. And then what happened was the parents all got together before they were transferred all over the world, because this was in the days before the internet. And if it happened in the days of the internet, the entire U.S. Army would have suffered. They would have been deconstructed and reconstructed, which is what should have happened. But in the days before the internet, the U.S. Army took every single one of the impacted families and they transferred them to the four corners of the earth, to the Philippines. We still had Subic Bay open at that time, to Okinawa, to Guam, to Germany, to everywhere in the world. But before they were transferred to the four corners of the earth, all those families got together and they burned down the Army daycare center. And that was a $500,000 arson done by all of the parents involved together. And that was 3 weeks after the original community services fire. So when that happened, the Army didn't arrest anyone, didn't blame anyone, just transferred them. And you never heard of it. But if you look it up, if you look up what I'm talking about, you'll find all of it is confirmed, including the fact that all of this was part of something bigger. November 1987, Army received alleged child abuse at 15 daycare centers and several elementary schools, 2 cases in the Air Force daycare center, another in the Navy. June 1988, a special team of experts were sent to Panama, where the military was buttressing the Panama Canal, had to investigate 10 daycare center attendees, children infected with AIDS. By the way, when my high school teacher, Gary Hambright, was convicted by a federal grand jury on October 1987, when he was indicted with 12 charges against children, not one of them was over 4 years old. And the worst one was the chaplain's daughter. Whatever happened to her was so bad, she wound up withdrawn into a shell the rest of her life, and she never came out. But another person that all of these people brought up was, aside from Mr. Gary, as they called my high school teacher, was Mikey. Michael Aquino was always described physically perfectly, down to a T. But I can tell you physically, he was never there. I can account for that because he was stationed in Washington, D.C. during the 2 years that this was going on, because I had to serve as his liaison and handle all of his calls. He was not physically there, but they all described him physically to a T. But in terms of what else we're dealing with, West Point is where this all kind of came to a culmination. June of 1984, a month before another case broke out at West Point, the Child Daycare Center at the West Point Academy grounds is Building 666. And a month in June 1984, a staff sergeant killed a 22-month-old child. He murdered her. And he got 18 months suspension and a dishonorable discharge. And he walked free because you can't sue the U.S. government. At that time, it was federally illegal. Constitutionally, you could not sue the U.S. government. He got off scot-free. And after that, July 1984, a 3-year-old girl found herself in the emergency room of West Point Hospital with a lacerated vagina. 50 children came out, photographed, smeared in excrement, eating and drinking urine and feces. West Point Academy grounds, fought all of the allegations. Many of the accusers, interestingly enough, were career military officers who didn't belong with the program. They weren't part of 1st Earth Battalion or DeltaNet. And this happened everywhere. Fort Dix, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Jackson. And at West Point itself, finally, Army Captain Walter R. Grote refused a promotion to major in June of 1985. And his quotation is, "I cannot accept promotion in a system that at first refused to acknowledge and now refuses to deal with the victims of extensive child abuse that occurred at the West Point Child Development Center." And after that, a great deal of many other officers resigned in protest of what had happened to their children. Well, this is exactly what Aquino wanted. And one of the last things I heard from him was a phone call saying, "Dietrich, we won. We really beat him. There aren't any Christians left in the military anymore." So we got 1 minute left, according to the physicist over here. And I pretty much, I think, have covered a lot of what needs to be covered. But I'm not quite sure if we should fill in airtime with some questions or if that should wait until afterwards. Or because of the caterers, what should we do? The caterers are not going to take no for an answer. They're just going to come in at what time, sir? 7. Okay, well. Yeah, so why were you flashing the cards? Do we have much time left, or?
Okay, we can go to 5:30, but we have to start our final speaker at 5:45. So, questions and answers?
Why not? Questions and answers, I'm happy to do it. I can't even see you right now, so it feels like I'm under interrogation. So if you... There's different programs of remote viewing. And what the CIA was working with was totally different from what the military was working with. Under Colonel Aquino, what they were working with was the summoning, the invocation, and the binding of demonic entities which would tell them what they wanted to know. So it's a totally different system from what you have with what the CIA was working with. In that sense, the CIA was very much on the light side in this. Does that answer it? I personally would not, but yeah, I mean, that's my opinion. I think Ed Daines is a charlatan and a fraud, and that certainly Colonel Aquino held him in low regard. And keep in mind, there's one thing I have to give Colonel Aquino credit for, is that he may be a warrior on the dark side, but he fully believes in what he's doing. And the one thing I can guarantee you is that when he does go to hell, he is going to join his master by his side. He is not going to be there in the pits. So when I'm dealing with Colonel Aquino, he's a man of enormous integrity in the sense that he would never betray his Lord. So I'm not promoting his church. I'm not recommending that you join. But I've never seen anyone as dedicated to their cause during the entire time I was involved in the military, Army or Marine Corps or Department of Defense, who mirrored his fanaticism and his dedication. Were you going to ask something, man?
Hold on, just 1 second.
Sure.
Let's turn this up. In order for the questions to be heard on the video, what we're going to do is hand you a microphone. We'd like you to speak your question into the microphone.
Great. Is there something we can do about the interrogation light?
No.
Thanks. I love you too.
Best wishes from
Yeah, thank you.
You said that the kids were identifying and describing Colonel Aquino
Yes.
to a T, but he was not the perpetrator. So I'm wondering why they were not describing John O'Connell, your teacher.
Oh, Gary Hambright, they did. They called him Mr. Gary. I may have miscommunicated that. They were describing him, but a lot of it was being passed up because he was, again, a sworn, ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. He had credentials. He worked with children all of his life. And so a lot of what was being dismissed. There were several different jurisdictions, as I said. The FBI, there was the ATF getting involved later. You had the Provost Marshal on base. You had the Criminal Investigation Division, which is under the JAG, Judge Advocate General. Then you had SFPD. Nothing was getting done because everybody's doing interdepartmental infighting. I hope that explains it. I mean, it doesn't justify it. That it was unforgivable. But.
Next.
I'm just curious about one thing. Are you saying or implying, or do you think that all the child abuse was being done only back then to drive away all the Christian military, or do you think it's still going on now?
Sadly, what the military is famous for, the U.S. military, a lot is brought up about the Japanese in World War II with their comfort woman. Well, the one thing I can tell you is, at least those women, as horrible as it was, were all adults. But in the U.S. military, it's always children overseas. And they're always, very young. Philippines, it used to be. That's one of the reasons why Subic Bay got shut down. One of the reasons why the U.S. military is no longer ported in Thailand, because the U.S. military kept coming back with all of the sailors infected with AIDS. When I was in Kenya, one of the things that I did as a mercenary, when I did serve as a mercenary for a short period of time, and I was going through Kenya, there was a U.S. carrier during the Clinton administration that had ported in Kenya. You would have thought every single sex worker in Africa had come out of the woodwork, out of the forests, to service those sailors. But at least in Kenya, it's different from here. In Africa, it's different from here because these are usually women who are saving up money to put their kids through college, quite honestly, and as opposed to women here who are in the United States who are on drugs. But at least there I didn't see the child phenomena, but it is so common overseas, so much exploited by a lot of military men. My father was a military man, career, for 30 years. He was not one of these guys. There's plenty of good men in the military, or at least there were. But it's overseas as well as here. It's still ongoing. And as for child abuse within daycare centers, let me tell you something. At the time that I was dealing with this phenomena, the U.S. Army was responsible for the daycare of 100,000 children. 100,000 children were processed through the U.S. Army daycare centers at the time that all of this was going down. You can imagine what else wasn't reported.
Yes.
Go ahead, you're fine.
Do you happen to know if General Tommy Franks was involved in the occult or is involved?
I do not know of any involvement with General Tommy Franks in the occult. Keep in mind, though, my period of time was a very critical period of time, a very decisive period of time, a time of great occult struggle. There was, as I mentioned in the summary for this presentation, there was a neo-Nazi blood mage by the name of Boyd Rice. Last name spelled just like the food. You can look him up online. And Boyd Rice is still around, still alive and kicking. And at that time, he was using the skinheads of Vanguard and the neo-Nazi kind of occult ritual to combat Lieutenant Colonel Aquino for occult dominance. So there was a major occult war going on. The Nazis and the Satanists do not get along. Do not let anyone, please, do not let anyone confuse you that it is the same thing. These are totally different paradigms. So please keep in mind what I said about the Japanese. Just as the Japanese were warning the Americans, you cannot call up a kamikaze. so too, what's going on between the Satanists and the Nazis is total warfare. They are not aligned to each other, as separate from each other as the Nazis and the Communists were. But in terms of what's going on now, I can tell you that what you have developing in the military is more and more of a prison mentality. It was there when I was in the military. Just like in prison, you have different ethnic gangs, the black nationalists, the white supremacists, the Latino revanchists, who are all fighting each other. There's a lot of diabolism. The cloverleaf 666 tattoos while they try to put the psych on each other. And that's essentially what goes on in the military. And it's become more and more of a prison environment because all of these, it should be obvious why it's becoming more and more of a prison environment, but they can't get people to volunteer, so they're giving people reduced prison sentences. Don't think otherwise. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So that's why you get these wholesome golden boys like Patrick Tillman, who after 9/11 says, I'm going to join and serve my country. He winds up being fragged in the back by a bunch of criminals in the U.S. Army Rangers. And the U.S. military did everything they could to hide it. He didn't know anything about prison culture, nor should he have. But it's sad, and it's pathetic.
Can you speak at all to child protective services and social services and to any daycare that they provide and these kind of problems?
I'm afraid I cannot. Obviously, my experience was totally within the military and the Department of Defense, but I appreciate your asking.
Okay, we got time for one last question.
Here is a very interesting question for me. As far as you could tell us, do you believe the Illuminati, are they lined up with the Satanists or the Nazi side or both?
The Bavarian Illuminati were a schism from the original Illuminati. The original Illuminati are indeed satanic and Luciferin. This is one reason why men like Aquino got so much support so that they could become official satanic chaplains in the U.S. military. But what happened with the Bavarian Illuminati was that Adam Weishaupt was trying to create something that was not globalist or internationalist, but rather pan-European. And through the Adam Weishaupt schism, a reformation occurred within the Illuminati that ultimately led to the SS. The SS derives its roots from the revolution of Adam Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati. But the SS, of course, was totally against classical Freemasonry, just as Protestants were against the Roman Catholic Church. I hope that that analogy makes sense to you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Oh, thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
What an outstanding. Give me some mic. Yarrow. What an outstanding presentation. I'm speechless. I just feel so honored to be in the presence of this wonderful presentation. We have Sophia Smallstorm coming up very soon. We're going to take a 15-minute break, so please refresh yourself.